let's make a start then. My talk is about the bit of the cooperative movement that did become quite big in Britain, and that of course is the British consumer cooperative movement. Now this is very much a potted history based on a book we published a couple of years ago called Building Cooperation. I'll say something more about that process in a second. But first of all, to establish what consumer cooperatives are. Consumer cooperatives are essentially co-ops that run shops, that basically provide food, etc., sell them to their members and the wider public. It's membership, if you like, of something that runs, if you like, a retail enterprise. And in Britain, for various reasons, it's the consumer cooperatives which very much come to dominate the whole cooperative scene. To some extent, it has to be said to this disadvantage, I think, of worker cooperation, because the relationship between consumer co-ops and worker co-ops in Britain has never been a particularly happy one. But I won't go too much into that today. But a quick word about the project. We began the project back in 2009. We were invited by the cooperative group. The cooperative group is basically the great grandson or granddaughter of the Cooperative Wholesale Society and the Scottish Cooperative Wholesale Society. We were invited by the cooperative group in 2009 to write its first business history since the 1970s. Well, at the time, of course, the cooperative group's fortunes seemed rather more rosy than they do now. And I think there was a certain amount of, shall we, celebratory atmosphere around the request. The idea was to produce a book that would coincide with the 150th anniversary. We got the proofs of the book back the week the bank got into trouble. So we had to rewrite quite a bit of the last chapter. Initially, I have to say, when they approached us, we were a little bit suspicious because we thought what they were after was some kind of hagiography, some kind of coffee table book, which we're not interested in. But it became very clear from our discussions that they were rather concerned with one of the points that the first speaker made, the way in which cooperation had fallen out of much of the discourse around business, economics, and indeed history. And they saw this as an opportunity to produce something that was serious and critical in order to get discussion of cooperation back into the mainstream. And we were lucky in the sense that we started work on the project just as the cooperative group was planning to move its headquarters about 100 yards up the road to its spanking new headquarters in Angel Square. And what that meant was all kinds of records appeared mysteriously from nowhere that no one had seen since the day they were written. For example, under somebody's desk they found this enormous, great big cardboard box, and in it they had all of the Grocery and Provisions Committee from the 1880s. Not very interesting, you may think. But in actual fact, it proved to be an absolute godsend, because what it contained was an enormous amount of information about the business strategies of the English CWS in terms of sourcing overseas produce. And some of the things it produced were really quite sensational, as I think we will see. So we were lucky to get access to records that historians really had seen for the very, very first time. And we think as a consequence we've been able to say a few relatively new things. So what I'm going to talk about, well, it's a bit of a kind of roller coaster. I'm going to take you very quickly through the rise and the reign of British consumer cooperation from the 1850s to the 1950s. We'll then look at the period of retreat from the 1960s through to the 1990s. And then the Renaissance, a recovery in the fortunes of British consumer cooperatives since the 1990s, only for the wheel to come off spectacularly in 2013. And I'll say something about the reasons for that. And in the kind of pictures we've got there, you've got a kind of pictorial demonstration of the rise of the cooperative movement from its tiny little store. This is the CWS's headquarters in 1863. Its headquarters in 1913, New Century House in 1963, and the new headquarters in Angel Square.
What city are these in?
Manchester.
Right.
Manchester, of course, very much the centre of the English cooperative movement. Scotland, of course, had a separate movement entirely, though increasingly the two work together very, very closely. So, we should, of course, talk about the emergence of consumer cooperatives. cooperatives. And you can't talk about the emergence of consumer cooperatives without talking about these guys, the Rochdale Pioneers, a rather miserable, austere-looking bunch. But I'd make 2 points. First of all, this picture was actually taken in 1865, 21 years after the pioneers set up their first consumer cooperative. They were actually very young men when they did it. Most of them were in their 20s. Most of them were from pretty working class backgrounds, quite poor, had families to look after. It was quite a dynamic movement in the sense of young people taking control of their own affairs. And the other reason why they look miserable, of course, is that in those days, when they took a photograph of you, you were told to keep very, very still, which meant that you didn't smile. But it's actually difficult to hold a smile for very long, which is why Victorians invariably look miserable. So very, very important, 1844, they set up their first tiny store. Very, very tiny little shop. And you can actually see up in the top corner up there the building where they opened their first store, Toad Lane in Rochdale. They opened for 2 hours when they first opened the shop on the 21st of December, 1844. The local gas company wouldn't put them on gas because they didn't think working people could run a shop, so they had to sell things by candlelight. The local wholesalers wouldn't sell to them because they didn't think they'd get paid. So they basically had to take a wheelbarrow into the middle of Manchester and buy stuff off the market there. And apparently when they got back to open the shop, local shopkeepers had paid various youths to hurl abuse and ridicule them. Well, they did in the end have the last laugh, because the pioneers proved to be very, very successful. Within about 15 years, they've got something like 4,000 or 5,000 members, a chain of branch stores, and even more than that, the idea is copied across the country. There's some of the key figures who later on became leaders in the Cooperative Wholesale Society, people like Charles Howarth, James Smithies, William Cooper, Sam Ashworth. These were very important figures. Very, very modest backgrounds, people who come to run a major national business. I would argue that CWS in the end is the first real British commercial giant. Of course, it's a democratic business, 1 member, 1 vote, and it was about meeting real needs. Life in early industrial England was nasty, brutish, and frequently short. Getting decent, reliable food was very difficult. Prices were often high. There are virtually no laws to protect the consumer. All kinds of things are done by private shopkeepers and bakers. Lead used to colour white bread. Arsenic frequently used as a preservative. Point about all this is that getting decent food in the 1840s was not merely a question of aesthetics. It was a matter of life and death. Getting decent food in the 1840s literally means the difference between living and not living. Of course, most working class men, certainly not the Rochdale Pioneers, none of them have the right to vote. There's no free education. Education only becomes compulsory in Britain in 1870. So many of the basic things we take for granted today just simply are not there. And as is often the case, cooperatives are formed to meet things that society simply are not delivering. And the model that the pioneers came up with proved to be very, very successful. It met real needs. It provided good quality food at affordable prices. The dividend, and basically you were paid a dividend depending on how much business you gave to the store, the dividend proved to be one of the earliest and most successful forms of working class saving. You could leave your money in the society and save up to buy furniture, etc. They were committed also to providing some kind of education facilities. The Rochdale Pioneers set up their first library within a couple of years. They had their own reading room. This is at a time, of course, when working class people are not regarded as being capable of reading or understanding the world. And it was always about running an effective business, but at the same time changing the marketplace and changing the world. It was quite deliberate from the outset. Now, what was stunning about the pioneers' model, about this model of cooperation, is that it proved to be spectacularly successful. How do we know that? Well, because co-op societies on the Rochdale model spring up all over the country. By 1850, there are something like 100 different co-op societies around Manchester alone. By 1900, there are 1,200 cooperative societies across Britain, with a membership that runs into millions and millions of people. When we look at the way working class history is often portrayed, there's usually a tremendous amount of stuff on trade unions and the Labour Party, and the poor old co-op doesn't get much of a look in. But the reality is that the cooperative movement was probably the first and the most effective form of working class organisation. It really did change people's lives before these other organisations came into operation. So modest beginnings, but very, very spectacular. These small dots represent consumer cooperatives across Britain in 1860. By the time you get to 1900, it's thicker still. And you'll notice that it's not evenly spread across the country geographically. It's no accident that the highest concentration of consumer co-ops tend to be in industrial and urban areas, particularly where working class people are already quite well organised in trade unions, etc. But it becomes very, very successful. One of the things that was the biggest sign that the co-op societies were successful was the fact that private traders started to whinge very, very quickly. Lots of evidence from the 50s onwards of private traders getting together, trying to persuade the local wholesalers not to sell to the co-op society. And this goes on right the way up to 1914 and beyond. Private trade has always regarded cooperation with a great deal of hostility. They felt very threatened by it. They were right to feel threatened by it. Because I would argue that up until really after the Second World War, the cooperative movement is streets ahead of the private retail sector in terms of its organisation, its sophistication, and its ability to meet working class needs. To try to combat this, one of the things the societies decided to do early on was they decided to set up a secondary cooperative, a cooperative of cooperatives that would act as a wholesaling wing for the movement, a cooperative wholesale society. So if private wholesalers start to cut up rough, co-op societies will have an alternative source from which they can buy supplies from the store. And the English Cooperative Wholesale Society, the product of a meeting at this place here, Middleton Farm in Manchester, comes into existence. That was the Jumbo Tea Party, because the farm was called the Jumbo Farm. And these are actually a copy of some of the minutes from the Jumbo meeting. They discussed the need for a cooperative wholesale, and by 1860, the decision had been made. They were going to form their own cooperative wholesale society. And some of the key people involved in that, inevitably some of the people from the Rochdale pioneers, but also from a range of other societies. And when the CWS comes into existence in 1863, 48 societies immediately join it. And of course, as the societies join and they pay their memberships fees, then CWS has funds with which it can buy produce and sell to the co-op societies. This is actually its first headquarters in 1863. It's registered in August 63, starts trading in March 1864, and 3 years later, its equivalent is set up in Scotland, the Scottish Cooperative Wholesale Society. A separate organisation from the English CWS in 1973, but it works very closely in collaboration with the English CWS, particularly when it comes to sourcing produce from overseas. Now, what's stunning about CWS is that its growth is exponential. Within 20 or 30 years, it's become a global retailing, a global wholesaling giant. More and more societies flock to join CWS and its Scottish equivalent. So much so that it has to set up separate branches in Newcastle and London. It gets into manufacturing goods. It works out early on that if it wants to retain the loyalty of the societies, it's a good idea to actually manufacture many of the things that they want to buy. So we see the establishment of Crumpsall Biscuits in 1873 in Manchester, a boot factory in Leicester established in 1873, a soap works in Durham set up in 1874. It even develops its own shipping line. By the 1880s, it's got its own fleet of ships, basically trading with the continent. And one of the things that's really stunning is that very quickly it gets involved in international sourcing of supplies. It goes out into the world. It sets up branches across the world in order to provide societies with produce from all over the globe. So, for example, it's starting to source butter from Ireland in 1866. It sets up its New York branch in 1876, based in the New York Produce Exchange. You can see a picture of it up there. One of its early managers in the New York branch, a man called John Gledhill, actually became a manager of the New York Produce Exchange. So he knew all of the major traders and all of the major producers across the United States. They're very, very successful. They're so successful that by the late 1880s, you've got private firms coming to CWS in New York saying, can you buy for us as well? And actually they agree to do it because it means they can buy in greater bulk and the societies will also get a better deal out of it. It's got a branch in Rouen from 1879, a branch in Copenhagen from 1881. Branches in Montreal follow, Gothenburg in Sweden, Sydney in Australia. By the early 1900s, it's got tea plantations in what was then Ceylon, today Sri Lanka and India. It has a global supply chain. Now this is long, long before anything like it is produced by private retail firms. It's operating highly sophisticated supply chains long before private retailers get into this. And one of the questions that we got interested in was, why does this happen? You know, this growth is absolutely phenomenal given the time. It is, again to echo the first speaker this morning, it's largely ignored by historians. Largely ignored. It's astonishing. You know, we sort of went through all of the different volumes of the Economic History Review and business history. Very little written about it. Very little. Why does it happen? Well, again, to echo the first speaker, the market plays a tremendously important part in the success and the growth of consumer cooperation in Britain. And it's important to understand certain things. Cooperative societies set up CWS and the Scottish CWS. And you might imagine that they therefore have an obligation to buy their supplies from those organisations. No, they don't. No, they don't. The co-op societies can buy from whoever they want. Now they, of course, have a certain incentive to buy from the CWSs because they get a dividend on the trade that they do. But ultimately, co-op societies are in a market situation. They're competing with private traders. They have got to get the best and the cheapest in order to stay in business. And co-op societies were very ruthless about that. Their attitude to the CWSs was, yes, of course, we want to give a certain amount of trade to CWS. CWS is important because it keeps all the private wholesalers on their toes. But actually, when it comes down to it, if CWS does not produce the right goods at the right price, we'll go to private wholesalers. And actually, sometimes it makes sense to use private wholesalers that are local. You don't have the same carriage costs, and you often keep people who otherwise might be hostile enemies politically on side. So ultimately, the co-op societies will buy what they want. They'll support CWS, but only if the price and the quality is right. So CWS has got to compete. compete. More than that, it's competing in a rather disadvantageous set of circumstances, because CWS, by and large, is not allowed to sell to private firms. Makes an exception on occasion, but generally speaking, it's not supposed to sell to private firms. CWS wanted, indeed believed, that it had a right to be the sole, if not the main supplier to the co-op societies, but the co-op societies saw it differently. What this meant was that in practice, CWS had to be incredibly competitive. Its only market are the retail societies, therefore it has to make the deal absolutely compelling for them. This is why CWS used the substantial amount of capital that it got from the societies to get into producing its own goods. This is why it develops a global supply chain, to give it a competitive advantage against local wholesalers. And they are ruthless. One of the most interesting things I came across, when they set up the Copenhagen branch in 1881, the guy they sent out to manage the Copenhagen branch, first thing he does, he says, oh no, we're not going to buy all that butter and bacon from the brokers and the merchants in Copenhagen. I want to go and talk to the farmers. Well, all the merchants and brokers in Copenhagen threatened to boycott trade with the CWS. The guy just called their bluff. Oh yes, you will do trade with us, because we are the biggest customer that you've ever seen. And he was right. In a matter of weeks, they climbed out. CWS proved to be one of the shrewdest operators. It found out who the suppliers were. It got alternatives when it could. When it found it hard to cut good deals on procuring tea, it buys plantations. Not because it imagines those plantations can ever supply everything that it needs, but it's sending a shot across the bows of all the other tea producers. If you try to diddle us and not give us a fair deal, well, we could always expand our own tea production. So it's a very aggressive operator, and it works. Inevitably, however, relations within the movement were never terribly happy. When you look at the records in the late 19th century, nay, right the way up until the 1960s, the co-op societies and the CWS are constantly criticising each other. The retail societies grumble that CWS isn't as efficient as it could be, and CWS dismisses many of the retail societies as a really disloyal bunch. And this is a recurring theme, I think, and a big problem with British cooperation. It is a federation of cooperatives, but my God, it's a dysfunctional one. At times, when you read the rhetoric used by cooperators, you would not believe that the word cooperative was the appropriate one. And this proves to be a problem for the movement. I mentioned earlier that one of the problems in terms of the relationships in Britain is between consumer cooperation and workers' cooperation. The consumer cooperatives never really trusted the worker cooperative movement. And the Cooperative Producers Federation always remains the Cinderella. And I would contend that one of the reasons in Britain you don't see many workers' cooperatives is because of that very dysfunctional and difficult relationship. Workers' cooperatives seem to have done rather better elsewhere. So it's a right old rum-do, a right old sort of strange relationship. But it does develop this very sophisticated network, both of the CWSs. They set up sale rooms and depots to basically support that sort of measles of cooperatives you can see across the country. They set up this network of depots to make sure that they can maximise their sales.
What's the difference between the different coloured dots?
Good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think that's to do with size.
To do with the
Size, I think,
right.
and membership. The darker, the more intense the membership, the larger the membership. They also start to integrate many of their operations. They get into farming in a big way from the 1880s and the 1890s. And you do find this situation where the stuff they grow on the farms then is channeled into their produce. The Middleton Preserve Works, for example, in Manchester, uses fruit that's grown on cooperative farms across the country. They start to brand their goods. I don't know if any of you saw that ghastly programme last year by Robert Peston when he talked about the retailing revolution, and he talked about how Sainsbury's was the first organisation to develop self-service. Crap! The cooperative movement developed self-service 20 years before Sainsbury's. How he talked about Marks and Spencer as the first organisation to develop their own branding in retail. It's a lie. CWS are branding goods from the 1870s. But it's not convenient for cooperatives perhaps to be given that amount of scrutiny, I suggest. They even become the principal shareholders in the Manchester Ship Canal. And the guy you can see down at the bottom right-hand corner there, J.T.W. Mitchell, is probably one of the great unsung leaders of enterprise in Britain. He's the president of CWS from the 1870s through to the 1890s, and he actually oversees the enormous expansion of what is a formidable business empire. And I'm just going to show off a few photographs just to give you a sense of the sheer size of this organisation. Cooperative Wholesale Biscuits. This is the Crumpsall Biscuit Works. They've become a major producer of their own biscuits and confectionery. The Durham Soap Works is replaced in 1894 by the Earlham Soap Works. Becomes a major competitor with Lever Brothers. There's a very famous legal case between the cooperative movement and Lever Brothers in 1910. CWS is the major competitor in terms of producing soap to them. And you can see, very, very sort of clear branding there. CWS bath cubes. Their own tea. At one stage, in 1890, the CWS tea department in London was producing 400 different blends of tea, just to meet the demands of retail societies. And travellers from the London tea department would go around the societies, letting people taste the tea and all the rest of it, and they would have to compete with Horniman's and some of the other big tea companies. But they're operating on a very, very sophisticated sort of scale. These are some of the big buildings of this period in Manchester. And one of the points I want to make about this is if you've got a Manchester today, just around Victoria Station, you still have what is called the Cooperative Quarter. This collection of really quite impressive Victorian buildings. And what used to happen from the 1870s, 1880s onwards is that co-op societies around the country would actually organise day trips to see these places. They had a massive kind of dining room. They really are incredibly impressive places. Local retail societies, if you go around some of the towns of Scotland and some of the towns of the north of England, some of the most impressive Victorian buildings you'll come across are actually cooperative societies. And they often encompass not just the store, they will also encompass a reading room, a meeting room above them. These were very much communal centres. There's a pride in cooperation. You can actually see cooperation as you walk down the street in the late 19th and the early 20th century in Britain. It has a presence which I think is sometimes difficult to grasp today. It provides cradle to the grave services. I mean, by the time you get to the interwar period, it's providing travel services. Funeral care, still one of the most successful branches of cooperation, depressingly so. The CWS Bank, formed in the 1870s, is also, up until fairly recently, a real success story. It starts off by basically providing loan finance for local societies. Later it lends to trade unions, local authorities, and of course by the 1970s it becomes a mainstream kind of bank. But finance is part of CWS's kind of whole remit, and the SCWS have their own banking organisation as well. This is a highly sophisticated and integrated organisation. And of course you've got the Cooperative Insurance Society, the CIS, part of this kind of clutch of financial organisations. So when we talk about the rise of cooperation, we are talking about a movement, in the case of consumer cooperation, which does develop a very, very strong public profile, which does command quite a big part of the market for a time. The cooperative movement by the 1950s still commands about a quarter of the retail market. It's still a very, very big player. During the Second World War, it plays a very important role. 25% of the British population get their rations from the local co-op. The CWS and the Scottish CWS in the Second World War basically take control of things like the provision of Canadian wheat. And the government has to work very closely with them because they're such big players. So we're talking about a giant, and a very successful giant. And indeed, it's very innovative. It's the first one to introduce self-service. It's the one that actually, it's one of the London societies, first of all, that does this. And indeed, the Cooperative Union and the CWS are producing pamphlets advising managers on how to run self-service shops as early as 1949. Long before anyone else is doing anything like this. But it's around about this time that the wheel starts to come off. Things start to go wrong. Certainly from the 1950s through till about the 1990s, we have a story of declining market share, a story of cooperative societies getting into more and more trouble. And by the time you get to the end of the 1980s, there is a real question mark of whether or not the cooperative movement can survive. So what went wrong? Why did this downturn happen? Some of the changes and some of the problems, I think, are related to wider social changes. One of the things to understand about co-op retail societies is that they were strongly embedded in local working class communities. Their shops served working class communities that had grown up as a consequence of industrialisation. The post-war period sees major social changes. The breakdown of many of those working class communities, people leaving those communities, people moving to the suburbs. It's also a time in which there is a tendency for people to turn inward, to be less involved in social and political movements. We know that party political and other forms of participation tend to decline. The home becomes more comfortable, etc. It's easier to stay at home and watch TV. Now we know that this has a direct impact on the cooperative movement. From the 50s onwards, retail societies are reporting fewer people turning up to movements, fewer people voting, and by the 1960s that's translated into falling membership. So they're starting to atrophy. They're starting to have a membership that's increasingly older, less active, and at the end of the day, any democratic organisation, be it a business or a political one, depends upon the willingness and ability of its people to be active. So there are major social changes which are chipping away at cooperation from the inside. What you've also got is increased competition. In the post-war period, like a lot of the British economy, we find that the great supermarket chains start to become large, public, limited companies. Sainsbury's, Tesco. Accessing vast amounts of debt and equity finance in order to create a new system of supermarkets, superstores, etc. And it's at this point, of course, that the private trade finally gets the whip hand. The CWS and the Co-op Retail Society simply can't match them for capital. And there's an additional problem. If you've got 1,000 societies and the whole geography of retailing is changing in the way that it is in the 50s and 60s, stores being located in new environments, people driving to the store instead of walking to it, well, it's much more difficult for 1,000 independent retail societies to adapt successfully to those changes. So in part, the thing that happens to cooperative movement is that the world changes, and it's very difficult for various reasons for it to change as quickly as it needs to. It did actually recognise the problems. In 1955, a special cooperative independent commission was set up under, it has to be said, a not terribly sympathetic cabal of Labour Party leaders. Hugh Gaitskell, shortly to become the Labour opposition leader, chaired the commission, and he was advised by Tony Crossland. Both Gaitskell and Crossland were, shall we say, part of a new generation of Labour leaders who were willing to make their peace with capitalism. They were the Tony Blairs of their time. And their view of cooperation was not terribly sympathetic. But we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the relationship between Labour and the cooperative movement has never been an entirely happy one. The Commission produces a report in '58, and what does it call for? It says, right, we've got too many societies. 1,000 societies, we need to get that down to 200. 200 big regional societies will have more capital to build new shops. They'll cover larger areas, which means it's easier to locate them in the right place. We also want a situation where CWS modernises its management. We want to set up a special body that will supervise the reform of the movement. Did it work? Of course it didn't work. Of course it didn't work. The reason it didn't work is that ultimately this is a cooperative democratic movement. No one can tell the retail societies what to do except the retail societies. Ultimately, change rested upon the ability of the retail societies to understand what was happening and to do something about it. And crucially, this comes at a time when retail society membership is declining, democratic participation is on the wane, and many retail societies, frankly, bury their heads in the sand and refuse to change. Well, the market has a wonderful way of making you change. Basically, I mean, you can see one of the problems here between the cooperative movement and an ordinary multiple chain. If you're Sainsbury's, your ability to sort of channel the best produce to your branches is quite straightforward. The cooperative movement by the 1950s is a real mess. Co-op societies will get some of their things from CWS, they'll get others from private producers, others from private wholesalers. And in many ways, the ability to try to mimic the kind of strong organisational features of the big private retail chains is very difficult for co-op societies to achieve. They're being overtaken, in other words. Now, on the surface in the 1960s, you might have been forgiven for thinking that actually none of this seems to matter. Because we find the cooperative movement doing all kinds of really quite spectacular things in the 60s. They build a spanking new headquarters at New Century House, cost of millions of pounds. CIS builds this enormous big tower in Manchester, the first skyscraper in Manchester. On the surface, it kind of looks as though it's business as usual. But the reality is that the movement by the 1960s is already in serious trouble. Large numbers of societies get into financial trouble. They simply can't sell enough. They're losing market share. And what we find happens is that one of the things the Commission had wanted, the creation of larger societies through amalgamation, does come about. But it doesn't come about in the right way. It comes from failure. Local societies merging with each other in order to pool their meagre resources and to keep going. So although retail societies merge and amalgamate, it doesn't come from a position of planned development or strength. There are efforts in the late 1960s to try to modernise the brand and modernise operations. They reorganise CWS, try to recruit more professional managers. They start to close smaller factories. They try to streamline brands. They introduce the national logo and this this kind of national operation known as Operation Facelift, in which CWS and other central organisations basically do deals with local retail societies to brand themselves all in the same way. And it all looks on the surface very impressive. But it didn't work. It didn't work. Market share continued to contract. And certainly what we find is that in the 70s and right the way through to the beginning of the 90s, we can see a process of increasing difficulty emerges in an effort to try to respond to that. By 1980, the promised 200 regional societies had become a reality. But this had come about largely through failure. Societies combining with each other as a response to a lack of profitability. To make matters worse, in 1973, the Scottish CWS gets into big financial trouble. Its bank made a number of dodgy financial investments. You'd never find the cooperative group doing that, would you? And what has to happen is that CWS has to step in and take it over. Now, one of the things that it did when it took over the Scottish CWS is that Scottish CWS actually ran some of its own shops. So CWS overnight goes from being a wholesaling organisation that sells goods to shops to an organisation that now actually runs a number of shops. So now, in some cases, it's in competition with the retail societies that it's serving. This does not make for harmonious relations. There's another development I should mention. Back in the 1930s, the CWS, in its wisdom, set up this strange-sounding acronym, the CRS, the Cooperative Retail Services. It was basically an ambulance service. It was a department of the CWS that if a co-op society got into financial trouble, CRS would go in, take the society over and run it and rescue it from financial doom. And in return, what would happen is the members of that society would get a certain amount of political say on the running of CRS. In 1950, CRS ran a series of stores across the country with an annual turnover of about £6 million. Quite modest, really. By the middle of the 1970s, it's taken over 160 failing societies, and it has a turnover of £250 million a year. It has become, as a consequence of cooperative failure, dismay and misery, a giant in its own right. And although it's supposed to be a sub-department of CWS, the fact that these societies it takes over gets representation on CRS boards has the effect of turning CRS effectively into a rival organisation. What you find happens is at the very moment the cooperative movement is getting into deep economic trouble, the dysfunctionality of the federation becomes even more dysfunctional. CRS and CWS battling against each other. Many of the bigger regional societies had illusions of grandeur. Many of them thought, we are now large organisations, we don't need CWS. So relations between CWS and the regional societies becomes ever more dysfunctional. You might imagine that the cooperative bank, which is actually quite a success story at this time, might get on well and work closely with CIS. Absolutely no way. It is an organisation, a movement of silos, of separate, almost warring factions who simply won't collaborate with each other. When we actually did the book, we interviewed a senior executive from this time, who shall remain named. And to quote, he said, at the time in the 1980s, we were trying to get the cooperative bank and CIS to try to work out some common products. In Manchester, the CIS tower was about 200 yards from the co-op bank. He said, I used to walk between the two buildings every day, several times. He said, Tony, he said, it was the longest walk in Manchester. They just could not work together. They just could not collaborate. So it was a very, very difficult and very, very grim time. And simply, you know, by the time we get to the 1980s, it looks as though this is going to result in failure. As it did in certain other parts of Europe. The German equivalent of the CWS failed in the 1980s. The Austrian equivalent failed in the 1990s. During the 1980s, there's quite a deep anti-cooperative economic climate that the previous speaker alluded to. The general sort of belief in the 1980s is that cooperatives and mutuals are organisations that have had their day and that ultimately they're on the way out. And actually, when you look at the position of the cooperative movement in Britain, it's difficult not to see some truth in that. The market share continues to decline. Its image goes from being this dynamic market leader of the late 19th century to being seen as a Victorian relic. There were some bright spots. The cooperative bank, which becomes a kind of mainstream bank in the 1970s, starts to be quite successful, largely through the idea of ethical banking. Other specialist parts of the empire do quite well. CIS does quite well on its own. Pharmacy and funerals also do well. But the shops, the retail wing, looks very much like a basket case during this period. So how did it manage to turn it round? Well, I think the simple reason that really brought about the turnaround was the fact that by the end of the 1980s, the movement was looking down the barrel of a gun. There was a realisation by the end of the 80s that unless some kind of reorganisation and some kind of revitalisation of the movement was accomplished, then ultimately the movement did not have a future. And they started to do certain important things in the early 90s. One of the things that they did in 1993 was to set up something called the Cooperative Retail Trading Group. What this did, whereas the CWS previously had bought goods or made goods and sold them to the societies, frequently unsuccessfully, what happened now was that this new organisation that was set up took on the role of buying for the retail societies. Rather than selling to the retail societies, it takes over their buying operations. CWS get involved in it, and more regional societies start to sign up for it. Which means it becomes easier to create national brands, national purchasing strategies and things like that. At the same time, there is a resurgence of cooperative values. In 1995, the International Cooperative Alliance issued a new international statement of cooperative values and identity, something that Julie will be talking about a bit later on. Also, of course, what the cooperative movement finds in the 90s is that ethics can make very, very good business. The movement develops fair trade, ethical banking, things which at the time had a certain appeal to certain parts of the market. They're very quickly imitated by the private sector, but the cooperative movement is very much in the vanguard of this kind of ethical fair trade business. In other words, in the 90s, the cooperative movement starts to recover some of its ethical and some of its value-based background. But undoubtedly, one of the great developments in the 1990s that really revitalised the movement was what came to be known as the Lanniker Affair. And it involved the guy we can see in the newspaper front page down there, a man called Andrew Reagan. Reagan was a city operator. He'd actually already done business with the cooperative movement. He bought a number of factories of CWS in the early 1990s. And from that, he plainly got the idea that it might be possible to actually buy up CWS and turn it into a private company. demutualise it. And he set up a special city consortium called Lanark, and in 1997 he tried to basically buy up the co-op. Now, in the end he failed, and he failed for a number of reasons. First of all, he didn't really understand the way the CWS is structured. Actually buying the CWS is quite complicated, and he did it wrong. But also, what it did was it created an enormous backlash from the CWS's membership, which was a kind of combination of societies, but by now was also contained a number of individual members as well. And quite simply, the movement unifies and beats the attack off. One of the things that really scuppered Reagan was that it emerged that he was bribing a couple of cooperative CWS officials for insider information. They subsequently served time for that. Now, the importance of Lanark, I think, is not so much that it was beaten off. I think its chances of success were probably quite slight, given the technical difficulties. The importance is that it galvanises the movement. It is the near-death moment that actually gets the cooperative movement to start to think seriously about its future and to actually entertain the idea of some kind of reorganisation. And the key figure is the guy on the left up there, Graham Melmoth, who took over as CEO of CWS in 1997 and largely led the fight back against the Lanark takeover. And what happens after 1997 is that there is a massive reorganisation within the group. 10 minutes. Basically what happens is the cooperative, the CWS and CRS merge, the bank and CIS are merged as well to form Cooperative Financial Services. And there's a new cooperative commission in 2000 which establishes what comes to be known as the cooperative group. And the way Melmoth describes it is this was intended to be a family of business, successful cooperative business based on all three words. And initially it seemed to work. Initially it seemed to do quite well. In the following 10 years there was some recovery in market share. There were even takeovers. The Summerfield supermarket chain was taken over, which looked a really good move at the time. Lots of things do, don't they? They took over Britannia Building Society, and they were seen to be poised in 2013 to actually create a new cooperative high street bank when they were posed to take over something like 650 branches of Lloyd's TSB. And then the wheel came off again. 2013 launches the worst crisis in cooperative history. It emerges that the Co-op Bank had inherited vast amounts of bad debt from Britannia, which had got involved in the shenanigans of the early 2000s, subprime mortgages, etc. It announces a £1.5 billion capital shortfall, £2.5 billion loss in 2013, and then it's launched a couple of major reviews, the Miners' Review into the governance of the cooperative group and the Kelly Report, which looked at the reasons for the failure of the bank. And both were pretty savage in their condemnation of the co-op group's internal practices. It was argued that the board of the cooperative group consisted of untrained people, that there wasn't enough scrutiny of the activities of senior managers, and that there needed to be an overhaul of the whole democratic structures of the group. There he is, Lord Miners. So Chris Kelly. Kelly in particular pointed out that the Co-op Bank had been poorly run before the crisis. It was pointed out that the Co-op Bank wasn't helped by the fact that following the crisis of 2008, banks were now required to hold more capital in order to meet demands, and that presented the Co-op Bank with certain problems. It pointed to the poor capabilities of the executive team, and of course inevitably its attention was drawn to the activities of its chair, Mr. Flowers, the so-called Christian Methodist. So it's all pretty bad and all pretty damning. That's actually from the Kelly points to the kind of growing crisis in the bank. And the fallout's been pretty revolting, pretty horrible, really. Effectively, the bank has been sold to bondholders to recapitalise it. The group is now a minority shareholder. It tried to sell the insurance wing, then changed its mind, and has since changed its mind again. The divvy's been scrapped. Pharmacies have been sold off to a Tory donor. The farms have been sold off to the Wellcome Trust. At least have found an ethical home. More sell-offs and rationalisations are on the way. It looks pretty grim. It's the most serious crisis in the consumer movement's history. Why did it happen? Well, we've been scratching our head ever since we got the proofs back from Oxford University Press. Well, we think now that basically what happens is the Melmoth reforms of the 1990s, which was about trying to revitalise cooperative commitment among managers and members. Ultimately, that did not take. It didn't change the philosophy of managers. In part, the successors of Melmoth, I think, didn't really buy into the idea of the cooperative ethos. There's a weakness of training and educational structures for senior managers, which continues, which Melmoth was trying to address, but wasn't followed through by his successors. And while we agree that there were certainly problems with the lack of expertise on the board, one thing cannot be ignored. If you look at the failure of many of the banks before 2008, they had plenty of expertise on their boards. Didn't stop them failing. We're not saying that the question of expertise and structure is not an important one, but we think that some of the problems may be a bit more fundamental than that. I think that part of the problem is that in the later 20th century, the membership offer for people to become cooperative members substantially weakens. There was a good reason to become a member of a co-op in the 19th century. The dividend was attractive, you were guaranteed sort of good supplies of food, and one of the things that's really come out of a lot of the research is that the local co-ops were very much social centres. People socialised through the cooperative. It played an important social function. We don't believe that it's possible to build that kind of member offer in the early 21st century. I'm not convinced that consumer cooperation really is the way that you're going to build that kind of membership deal anymore. Can we build a strong member offer using retail? It's a tall order. We're now in the age of internet grocery retailing. You might say, well, what about fair trade and ethical trading? Well, it worked in the 90s, but they're all ethical traders now, or are all able to depict themselves as such. That's the key thing. So there's a problem, I think, with the whole kind of consumer retail, consumer cooperative approach. And one of the questions that occurs to me is, should the cooperative group look to relocate its identity, its activities, its ethos and its values into other commercial activities where the prospect of developing a member offer might look better? Health, social care, legal services. Up until the crisis of 2013, I think the cooperative group were already thinking of repositioning themselves in terms of the type of commercial activities they're involved in. But the thing they had their eye on was finance. Well, that looks pretty sick after 2013, doesn't it? So where else can it rebuild itself? Because I think there are three potential outcomes here, just to finish. It can carry on doing what it's doing at the moment, in which case you've got to say that the chances of it continuing to lose market share, especially with the emergence of Aldi, etc., is pretty real. And the long-term prognosis there, you know, eventual commercial failure. It's quite possible it's happened elsewhere. On the other hand, it can continue to focus on retail, But it can reorient its strategy and basically water down its ethical identity. It can become Aldi Mark II. Now there might be, you know, a kind of commercial future in doing that, but that road leads to demutualisation and the end of the organisation's cooperative identity. It could continue to focus on retail, but it could contract into niche markets with a smaller organisation and a much smaller membership. There might be a future in that, but as a